Okay, I think we're almost ready to kick off. We have the last people coming into the room. And wait for the doors to close. All right. So, welcome everyone to tonight's Festival of Urbanism event. And we've got a fantastic audience here in the beautiful Chow Chuck Wing Museum, and I'd like to say hi to those zooming in online this evening. I'm Sophia Malson. I'm a senior lecturer in the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning and director of the Urban Housing Lab. And it's my pleasure to be chairing this event. But before we begin proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built, and as we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within this university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. And whenever we're talking about cities, I think this is something really important to acknowledge. So digital platforms increasingly mediate our experiences of the urban, reconfiguring our relations with governance and others in different ways, some of which we may not even be aware of. So platform urbanism is therefore an important area for planners, policymakers, and indeed anyone interested in the city to be thinking about. So to delve into this topic today, we have arranged an incredible lineup of speakers, all of who are experts within their fields. So we're going to hear from each of them in turn for the first half of the session, before moving to the discussion and then some audience Q&A. Thanks to those of you who have already sent through questions for our panel, and we'll also have roving mics around for members of our live audience. So as you're sitting through this session, please think of some of the burning questions that you want answered. So first, let me introduce our speakers. Joining us from Amsterdam is Niels van Doorn, Assistant Professor of New Media and Digital Culture at the University of Amsterdam. His research asks how digital platforms are reshaping how people work, earn a living and care for each other in urban environments. And here with us in the museum tonight are Dr. Sarah Barnes, urban strategist, researcher and author of the acclaimed book, Platform Urbanism, Negotiating Platform Ecosystems in Connected Cities. Sarah is an industry fellow at the QUT Design Lab and visiting fellow at the University of Melbourne Centre for Cities. We're also very lucky to have Rory Brown, Associate Executive Director of Smart Places at Transport for New South Wales. Rory was also the architect of the flagship Smart Western City program to co-create the Western Parkland City as a future-focused, digitally enabled city. And finally, we have Dr. Justine Humphrey, Senior Lecturer in Digital Cultures at the University of Sydney. And Justine's work addresses the smart cities and datification of urban life with a focus on the mediation of home and urban space. So let us turn to our first speaker, Sarah Barnes, who will be taking us through some of the key ideas and thinking around platform urbanism and what we actually mean by this. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here today. I too would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and as the land of which I speak, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I love to learn about country-centred stories and city making wherever I go. For, I guess, the last 15 years now, I've been really interested in this interface between digital technologies and how we interface with the different kinds of screens and environments, multi-sensory spaces that we navigate through via technologies in cities. It's been a long-term journey and fascination for me. Around about I guess 2013, I then, after working for a number of years at the ABC and other organisations looking at R&D projects for future technology, I started to think about this interface between technology and cities in everyday life. And it was around 2013 that I started to think in terms of platform urbanism. This kind of word popped into my head. It was like, we are actually going to become urban through our platform interactions. And I thought this would have kind of quite fundamental significance for the future of cities, for the way in which we would navigate cities, but also the infrastructural design of cities, and I guess the ways in which even planners and engineers and designers would actually come to be able to do their work and know about cities. So this work of platform urbanism has been something of a fascination now for, I guess we're coming up to 10 years now. I wanted to just show these photos, these scenes. These are scenes from urban life. Here we are in the train. Here we are outside the Opera House. I admit this is actually a scene from Pokemon Go when it took off around Sydney, but still, it does kind of feel like when you're walking around spaces these days, this is what you see. Here's another scene, a very familiar scene. I'm sure we've all done something like this when we're visiting or going out at night, whether or not there's projections on buildings. I think the things that fascinate me about these images and these scenes is that while we definitely see a focus on the mobile phone, right? The mobile phone's a key thing here. There's lots of different kinds of activities that everyone is engaging with. Okay, this is a multiplayer game, but perhaps we're actually looking at people navigating the streets. People here on the train could be doing any number of things. They might be reading a book even. They might be, scrolling Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or what have you. But I guess the key thing for me is that how we interact via these devices is multi-sensory and can mean all kinds of things. So I didn't really think necessarily in terms of like mobile phone urbanism, for example, right? I thought about it in terms of platform urbanism because I guess embedded in these devices are lots and lots of technologies, but also lots of interface strategies, engagement strategies, and business strategies. It was around the time that I was thinking about this kind of concept of platform urbanism that we saw a bunch of books come out that started to really tease out what the implications were of the platform, not necessarily like apps or social media, or even mobile devices or Internet of Things, but actually like the platform as this unit of analysis. So some business strategists thought about it in terms of the platform revolution, the way platform strategy was actually reimagining business. The thing about platforms being that you could actually encourage people to generate value on your platform without you doing that work. So there's this kind of different way of thinking about business strategy here. At the same time, there's also this negative response, this really critical response, looking at the way that platforms embed new kinds of data surveillance and data capture within platforms. And this has really come to light, I think, more obviously in the last sort of 5 years since the tech clash has arisen. Really obvious that, I guess, many platforms are there to really engineer sociality and interaction in ways that may not necessarily be good for our society. So it was these kinds of background ideas that really led me to write a book on the topic of platform urbanism. And this is my book, Platform Urbanism, which was really thinking about the mode of strategy around platform design and platform engagement as actually urban strategy. In a sense, the way we look at these images, the interfaces between the digital and urban are so blurred now. So what are the ways that platform strategy is actually changing the experience of spaces, their design, and also the way that governance bodies can manage and support the making of good places? So I'm just sort of really offering some high-level thoughts here before I know we're going to hear from a wonderful panel of speakers about some great examples and domains that platforms are impacting. But just some reflections that I would offer here, which I do make in my book. That I think about platforms as really highly engineered digital spaces of interaction and value creation. For me, what's essential about the platform is that for anyone to use your platform, they're creating their own value there. So we don't necessarily take on a platform to implement another company's technology strategy or even a government's technology strategy. We use platform because they're meaningful and create value for us, whether we're a rider in an Uber or a driver of an Uber. We're not forced to implement someone else's technology strategy. I think that's a really important distinction between platform strategy and other kinds of technology strategy. I see platforms as very participatory, potentially. They're always spaces of open innovation. People create their own value. They create all kinds of things on platforms. But unfortunately, I think the form that we've seen in recent years shows us that the value generated on platforms is not shared equally. And we've seen that with the rise of big data in particular, where the data value that's generated from platforms is harvested and used to generate new kinds of AI applications through machine learning and so forth, which makes a platform more sticky to its users, but doesn't necessarily mean that value is being shared. I think about platform urbanism in the sense that we're all platform urbanists. We're all generating the data. We're all implementing these kinds of platform strategies wherever we go. How we interface with platforms, the choices that we're all making, shapes how we experience and move through urban spaces and settings. A really critical point here, and I guess I would conclude on these points, is that I see these questions around the design, interface design, business strategy, but also governance as really increasingly critical to the management of cities and to the management of places. The kinds of data that is being generated through platform ecosystems is really critical to the work of planners, to the work of governments in knowing what is happening in a place at any one time. So data partnerships that can support improved kind of relationship between platform ecosystems is increasingly the stuff of urban planning and the stuff of urban governance. So we see here in these ways in which, I guess, for me, platform urbanism affects the everyday in a really simple way that we move about the city, but is really fundamental also to the design and governance of future cities. And I think I'll conclude on that point.
Thank you, Sarah, for kicking us off there on, I think, what is an excellent introduction to platform urbanism. And next, we will turn to Niels, who is actually able to join us because of the magic of platforms today. So I will switch over to you, Niels.
Wait, first I had to unmute and I'll share my screen again. Yeah, I hope people can hear me. So, full screen. Yeah. So, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. I'd like to use the time I have to talk to you about and to think about platform urbanism by talking about one example of tech innovation and disruption, if you will, and I'm using quotation marks for a reason, as you'll see, that has impacted cities over the past 2 years. And that's namely rapid delivery services, also called instant delivery or flash delivery, quick commerce. And I want to talk about these rapid delivery platforms in the Amsterdam context and think about it mainly in terms of like, how can we not think about it in terms of disruption? Disruption was also one word that was used in the description of this panel. So I'd like to kind of problematize this. Let's go to the next slide. So first, a little bit about this kind of the quick rise and then not yet fall, but definitely some problems they're running into of these rapid delivery services. So it's really kind of a thing that came up during the pandemic. So in 2020-21, we really saw all of a sudden this huge peak in customer demand for delivery, and especially also then with a lot of the branding that came into it, a lot of quick delivery. So there was a huge demand. There was also a huge labor supply, especially because of a lot of service workers losing their jobs. jobs, needed some other form of income. And of course, in this time, there was still low interest rates, so an abundance of funding. So all we saw, especially in Europe, but also in other continents, we saw this incredible rise of these quick and rapid delivery platforms such as Gorillas, Getir, which I'll talk about in a moment in the Amsterdam case. And then all of a sudden they were everywhere, and everybody was using them because the customers were getting incredible discounts because of all the venture capital that these companies were burning. Now, this was the last, so to say, the 2 pandemic years, but now since 2022 and ongoing, we see kind of a new reality for these delivery platforms. This is, I would call it a post-pandemic reality of decreasing demand because people are again, like the lockdowns are over, people are moving outside, doing groceries again, but also because of inflation, people are spending less. There's decreased funding because interest rates are being hiked. So these companies cannot really use or give discounts to customers that much anymore. And this is the thing I really mainly want to talk about. We are seeing in cities like Amsterdam, but also in Paris and Berlin, we are seeing regulation coming up. Now, the thing is with this regulation, and that is in Amsterdam, it happened in a very haphazard and kind of knee-jerk manner. And it was very much focused on this idea of a public nuisance. So a lot of neighbors complaining about these abundance of bikes and other types of vehicles that were standing in their neighborhood. But there was also a very racialized discourse, I want to add, because people were complaining about these men, these delivery workers, mostly migrant men, who were ostensibly smoking weed and causing trouble in their street or on their square. So whereas, for instance, in Berlin, we saw a very different discourse where people were demanding regulation, which was very much focused on working conditions of these riders. And these delivery workers, for instance, for Gorillas, the company Gorillas, were protesting their working for better working conditions. In Amsterdam, those protests weren't there, and the discourse was very much focused on the livability of these cities, and there was a very racialized discourse again. So suddenly, these companies were told to leave. They had to all of a sudden close their dark stores. So dark stores are urban small warehouses where they store their groceries. And all of a sudden, even though they could previously operate in city centers, they were told to pack up and leave for the outskirts of the city. Now, Getir, which is one example, is a Turkish rapid delivery company, heavily funded also by the likes of SoftBank, etc. They first tried to appeal this decision in court, but when a judge ruled in favor of the municipality, Getir had to get creative. So what they did, interestingly enough, they went from dark store, which nobody could enter, to what they created art stores, what they called art stores. They also created supermarkets. So they reorganized their dark store so that people could actually enter and pay. Now, mind you, there's hardly any customers that actually go in and use Getir because they're relatively higher priced than a local supermarket. But this is how they try to get around, and are still trying to get around these new regulations, which again were very sudden and were kind of overwrought because they didn't know how to deal with this new disruption again that was caused by dark store. Now, this is a statement by Getir, which I think is really kind of interesting, and which also begins to allow us to question this notion of like kind of techno-capitalist firms dictating the future of the city, or a one-way street, or a matter of just kind of technological disruption that we would see with this what we consider to be platform urbanism. So the Getir said, by offering, and this is a statement in relation to their opening of these art stores, by offering local artists space to exhibit their work, Getir provides a social contribution while simultaneously enhancing the public appearance of these buildings. Getir is here to stay and will continue to learn and innovate to meet the wishes of stakeholders and to embed itself in the city. So what I find really interesting here is indeed, how do these platform companies, these tech companies, seek to embed themselves into the city? Now, Then the question becomes, and these are the key questions also in relation to the description for this panel, is disruption the key dynamic of platform urbanism? And are techno-capitalist firms really dictating the future of the city? I'd say that disruption is the notion of disruption here is not just problematic in a descriptive sense, meaning this is really not how things work in practice, but also in a normative sense, because it focuses on the inscrutable and unaccountable nature of tech platforms, kind of this black box. That's also the problem when you use a black box metaphor, and on a unilateral dynamic. Just basically dictating, private firms dictating public and the common good, and it focused on a private-public economy. And what is so problematic, I think, about this, when we want to critically think about platform urbanism and what impact these companies have, these rapid delivery firms, is that it lets city governments off the hook. Right, so it's not just techno-capitalist firms that dictate what future cities will look, feel, and function like. The process is, I would argue, much more negotiated, much more political, because we tend to forget that element, and much more historically layered. We should not forget that cities are entrepreneurial, and especially Amsterdam wants to be a key startup city. It has this whole, there's several different programs in which it basically wants to operate as an incubator and a facilitator of tech firms. So like many other cities, though, it lacks expertise and it lacks capital. And this became especially prevalent during the pandemic with respect to logistics and delivery of particular goods and services. So platform companies are potentially really interesting partners as well. They offer new opportunities, but also come with new challenges. And as we've seen with this short example with rapid delivery services in Amsterdam, only when they produce so-called negative externalities do municipalities suddenly jump into action and often with these haphazard regulatory initiatives, which is then contested. But, and this is also interesting or part of the point, it also is generative of new initiatives that reorganize urban space. Because first these premises were vacant, then they became dark stores, then they become art stores, which then changes the discourse and changes also the different groups of stakeholders and changes how these neighborhoods can function and who profits of it or who benefits from it and who is left out. So then finally, with our team, our platform labor team, we would like to, or we prefer to think about these processes of platform urbanism in terms of actually existing platformization. So I want to finally end here with a couple of thoughts. Moving fast and breaking things is no longer a sustainable option, if it ever was. Maybe in the beginning, it was mostly about a technological process of rolling out the software, getting everyone to use it, and then basically saying, well, we're here and we're going to stay. But this was maybe in 2016, 17. These days, it is no longer a sustainable option. And after an initial rollout, platform companies have to find other ways to embed themselves in the city. So platform companies seek to become institutionally embedded as well. And they do so by engaging in boundary work, not just testing the boundaries of what's allowable, what's legal, but also doing everything in their power to expand the boundaries of their platform and to become more and more embedded and kind of spread out their tentacles, much like Facebook or Google spreads out its tentacles over the web, and there you see a platformization of the web. Platformization of cities, of urban life, is very much not just a technical, but also an institutional and social process. And finally, so then we would say platform urbanism, and this kind of, the wager for this panel, perhaps we can talk about this. Platform urbanism is a path-dependent, incremental, highly political process of negotiation and experimentation. We see a lot of antagonism, especially in the courts, some protests, but we also do see a lot of partnerships and a lot of new connections being developed, which again benefit certain groups of people while actually hurting the future and hurting also the future city as it is experienced by other residents. So I'd like to end here, and I'll stop this share.
Thank you, Niels, for that incredibly fascinating insight, actually, into the context in Amsterdam, or situation in Amsterdam. And I think that's a really important thing to take away here, is that context is important when we're talking about platform cities and smart cities, because it does sort of evolve in these ways that are, aren't uniform, and pushing back on that sort of normative narrative that Niels identified there. So to see how this is actually playing out in practice as well, and how it's playing out in practice here in Australia, in New South Wales, I'll hand over to Rory. That's our next presenter.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody. So first of all, thanks for having me. I feel that I'm quite fortunate to be in such esteemed company. It's actually my first time at the University of Sydney, believe it or not, even though I've been in Sydney for quite a while. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Fantastic. Let me just check that I'm going in the right direction. All right, there we go. All right, so look, I'm probably going to take a little bit of a different tack. I do stand here representing New South Wales government, so I probably need to kind of speak within a certain swim lane. But I did want to help you understand how we are thinking about smart cities, about smart places, and what indeed might be our approach to thinking about the platform in terms of how that all works together. And when I was going through what would be interesting to talk about, I do actually think there is still a question potentially that needs to be asked in terms of, why do we need smart places fundamentally? Like, are places not good enough already? Do we not have good enough design? Is there something around the planning and the implementation, or is there more? And what role should technology play? Which is the space that we think about quite a lot. So the smart tech in infrastructure. And look, the answer is a resounding yes. I think there are, huge threads or themes that we really fundamentally need to tackle as society. There's obviously a big piece around equality and inclusion. And you don't need to look too far, or even look too far back to see through COVID that there was fundamentally those who had and those that did not have, and we saw real challenges around exclusion when we were all being locked up. And there were some, I remember seeing this picture of someone trying to do teaching a school online, and they were sitting on a stool in the middle of the field because it was the only place that they could actually get digital connectivity to be able to deliver the class. Or terrible stories where Wi-Fi was being turned off in parks, which was a community service, and to stop people congregating. So we really got to think about that, and we know this from things like the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, that there's a disparity between our regional and metropolitan areas, but even within our metropolitan areas there's disparity as you essentially go out west, and we need to think about ways to sort of challenge that. I think the next big thing is obviously about a sustainable and resilient future, and that cannot be solved unless we have the technology and data and analytics in place to do that. And just to give you an example, like Western Sydney, I think is forecast is going to start to have 50-degree days right in the future. So, yes, we need to think about sort of different materials, but we also need to think about how do we use scarce resources to get the best green the green infrastructure, right? So, but that needs water. So how do you minimize your water usage? That's analytics, it's data, it's information. It's about smart. And the final bit is a productive economy. If you're interested in the Productivity Commission released its draft report on use of digital data. And they basically said there's lots of information about you around, but we're not using it very well at this point in time. And that's probably a theme I'll pick up later. And I think that speaks to the challenge around what is the platform for us to be able to kind of do this appropriately. So next thing, if we do need smart places, what makes a place smart? In my mind, actually, it can be quite simple. And we sometimes sort of overcomplicated a little bit, but in essence, it does come down to we got to get data about a place, right? So you're going to need some sensors, you're going to need cameras, it's going to be existing information. There's lots of stuff that's locked up in 2D and old systems, but we need to liberate the information. We need to be able to house and protect it. Obviously, some of that information has associated privacy and concerns, but we need to make sure it's cyber secure. And then we need to analyze it. And I think that's the big challenge that we have right now in terms of both the analyzing and sharing. If you wander down any street, you're going to see lots of tech out there already, but it's just for one particular use. And the people generating the information from that tech, they're certainly not sharing the data. And that seems to be a bit of a waste. We don't want to have a future where we're having to sort of multiply the amount of technology in a place to get the information. A lot of it might be already there. And then once we've done that, we actually need to use it. So we're all for data-driven decision making, and I think that we kind of actually need to leap into it. The reality is the ability to use advanced data analysis such as machine learning and AI is going to get democratized, right? I was at Google last week and I was having a look at effectively self-serve AI analysis, which is sort of kind of quite scary. So imagine where that goes in sort of 3 to 5 years' time, but we need to be ready for it. So if that's what takes place, that's what we need to make a place smart. What does it look like? Do you know what? Smart places should just look like the places today. Technology needs to be built in, and it's about delivering better outcomes for that place, whether you're a business, whether you're a community, a user passing through. It kind of doesn't really matter. And I could go on a bit more in this slide, but the key message is smart places are just places. Places are for people, but we got to plan it in. And that brings me to my final point for sort of what is government doing about it, and you know, why am I speaking essentially at something about platform and platform urbanism. So a lot of my thinking ultimately comes down to not going, I'm not looking to enrich technology companies. I'm not looking to slow down innovation. What I am actually looking for is that we take advantage of this, but we take advantage of it at scale. And right now, we see lots of great initiatives, but we don't see anything that's growing. We don't see it replicating. There's no consistency. City of Sydney could be doing something great, but North Sydney maybe not, and so forth. So we think state government actually has a role to essentially have the platform to allow smart places to go from seed to scale. And that platform would have a number of things. It's going to be about sort of obviously policy, maybe a small p policy, artifacts, context, guidance, toolkits, those things, best learning practice. It's about getting the word out as well, showcasing what can be done, helping local government see and give them trust that they can take a successful initiative and then make it their own. They don't need to go through the hard work. But there's also challenges on just the governance model, like how do I adopt it quickly and easily? And so those are some of the things that we're thinking about government. Yes, there needs to be a bit more money come in, but in the end, the benefits of Smart Place, and we looked at it, says that it pays for itself. So the question now is not, you know, can we do it? Does the tech work? That's ultimately solved. We're actually coming to a fundamental culture and people challenge, and we need the platform to enable that to become normalized going forward, but ultimately going forward in a way that we as humans are comfortable with. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rory, for demystifying, I think, some of the smart city sort of ideas and how it rolls out in practice on the ground, because we can get very caught up in what it means intellectually, but not quite what that looks like in our everyday lives and the way that government perceives it. And so finally, we have, closing out our panel, our list of speakers today, Dr. Justine Humphrey, and Justine will be talking to us around platforms and homelessness. So over to you, Justine.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to see everyone here. I also want to acknowledge the traditional landowners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders emerging past and future. So I'm going to be talking about what digital platforms do to public space and to people who inhabit public space in different ways. The first thing to consider is that public space is contested. It's a contested idea, and there are various meanings and uses of public space. Doreen Massey famously proposed that space has power geometries, and what she meant by that is that space is a political and social production, and that groups are subject to different treatment as a result. The gendered aspects of public space have long been subject to discussion and critique by feminist urban scholars and planners. People who are unstably housed have a different relationship to public space because of their need to inhabit shared zones for longer periods of time, to rest, to eat, to seek out services, and to charge their mobile phones. Homelessness, especially street homelessness, has historically been subject to high levels of policing, and urban objects, we can see a few of them here, are co-opted into enacting policies to remove, displace, and monitor rough sleepers. Digital technologies are also a key means through which different groups are policed in public space. As public space becomes increasingly mediated, and I think Sarah did a fantastic job of talking a little bit about how that happens and what are the devices that enable that, this has implications for the mobilities of these groups and the challenges and the opportunities of these spaces. So in research that I've conducted on digital access in smart urban environments, people who are homeless, but also young people, gig workers, groups displaced by war and conflict, have greater access barriers that in turn produce new imperatives of movement in search of phones, internet, and power. But digital mediation also changes space. Just as space becomes a resource and place for maintaining mobile connectivity, it also becomes augmented by data. Kitchen and Dodge call the invisible data zone code space. Mackenzie referred to it as wirelessness, but we also have more recent concepts like platform urbanism, which help us get to this sort of understanding of the hybrid spatial formations that emerge in the mixing of coded software flows with physical space. So one of the ways that the space is being digitally transformed is by embedding sensors in street objects like kiosks, benches, light poles, streets. This data is then subject to automated and algorithmic processing to change some aspect or feature of the space. So this is the smart cities model. Rory helped us to understand that. And it can have great public benefits. And this is the big challenge, I guess, is to try and realise that benefit in terms of the new knowledge and how that knowledge is acted on. So, for example, these InLink models on the right have outward-facing connectivity and information services that generate data through people's interaction with them, but they also have a number of inbuilt sensors which, when networked, perform to create a larger network that can then use data in particular ways. So, for example, counts of Wi-Fi-enabled mobile devices, whether you're registered for the service or not, can be used for location-aware advertising, as displayed on this large double-sided digital screen on the right. One of the outcomes of the code space generated by these objects is that it creates new possibilities for making groups visible in that space and being acted on in particular ways. And this is where I think we encounter some real challenges that we need to think about with the datification of urban space. One technology introduced into the InLink kiosk in London provides an example of the way that digital platforms are used to predictively police communities. In late 2018, reports emerged of the use of InLinks for drug dealing activities in a small South London borough called Tower Hamlets. This is a very ethnically diverse area, local police identified that up to 20,000 calls were purportedly being made to known dealers from a small number of kiosks over a 4-month period. A call blocking algorithm was developed and rolled out in partnership with police and the company manufacturing these devices to prevent calls being made to certain numbers using a call pattern recognition system based on indicators such as call frequency, how long calls lasted, and other intelligence gathered from authorities. This remote shaping of technology was carried out without community involvement, and its impact has never been scrutinised. Its long-term implications remain unknown, even though it continues to filter the space around it in quite specific ways. And a key question I want to ask you, and that the community may also have asked, is that there may have been other ways of addressing the root causes of these issues, which were a function of poverty. So this is a really important factor, and when we're thinking about code space, it's not just limited to street level. Different vertical and horizontal scales change how spaces are seen and sensed. So drones and robots are increasingly being used to monitor marginalised populations, including homeless encampments. This extensification of the exploitable code space, as the data justice advocate Taylor has cautioned, carries with it the dual risk of rendering certain groups invisible and misinterpreting what is visible. And this relates to the question that I want to end on. Do digital platforms cause homelessness? So far we've talked about policing, we've talked about the potential benefits of digital platforms in urban space. Short letting platforms like Airbnb reshape space in a variety of ways and quite distinct ways to smart and street technologies. Platforms such as these disrupt the spatiality of housing access and internalise access to housing only to those who can be exploited for short-term profit. The result of this is reduced options for longer-term rentals, increased prices for remaining rentals, and the shifting of longer-term rentals further away from the city. So while digital platforms are not the only cause of homelessness, they contribute to the conditions of disadvantage that lead to homelessness, and they may prevent people from escaping it. So the flip side of the hypervisibility that comes from exploitable code space is the invisibility of certain groups and their exclusion from that space entirely. If you're interested in reading more about this, I have a book coming out later this year on the research that I've been carrying out for the last decade on homelessness and mobile communication and the internet. So please feel free to get in touch if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justine, and I think we'll all be keen to have a look at that book, but really pointing out there the sort of uneven experience of the platform city, I think, dependent on exactly who you are, and referring to those, I guess, those power relations that we've seen across many of the presentations today and in how that affects what the smart city or platform city is to us. So I'd now like to call all of our speakers up onto the podium, I guess, the chairs there for a discussion, except for you, Niels, you can zoom in, and we'll open up for some Q&A. Are we all good? Yep, we're right. So what I might do first is I will ask the audience, anyone who has questions, to notify wherever our roaming mic is to put your hand up for Nicole. But to kick off, I'm going to... Did anyone get that? To kick off, I'm going to ask a question that was submitted from our online audience. So it gives everyone in the room to think of something in this time. But first of all, one of the questions, which is quite a broad one, but in all of these presentations today, and indeed in the brief of the session, we hear a lot about smart cities and also platform urbanism. So what is the difference between smart cities and platform urbanism, if there is one, or are they sort of an interchangeable kind of concept? There you go. Maybe not an easy one. Maybe it is an easy one. So I'll open it up to who wants to jump in. Sarah, yes.
I'm happy to answer that one, but I'm sure everyone has views. I guess I've seen the rise of the smart city concept the last couple of decades as being one that's very much a deliberate strategy on behalf of a combination of government and business to kind of operate the city, whether it's originally it was from a kind of centralised perspective, but nevertheless it's very much linked to urban-wide strategy. Whereas I personally see platform urbanism as much more about the range of different activities of a whole range of different groups that are all kind of co-creating and creating a city, but through their entanglements and relationships to platforms, whether that's business groups, apps, platform companies specifically, but also users and of course governments who are looking to regulate them. So that's a perspective, I guess, that I have.
Anyone else want to add? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have that much to add to that really great answer, I guess, or that interpretation. I just maybe say that, yeah, whereas smart city discourse and the actual practices around smart cities focus more on technological infrastructures, datafied technological infrastructures. I'd associate platform urbanism also more with another way to accomplish the same goal. And the goal of both are frictionlessness and optimization. So optimizing all kinds of processes, making maybe also more cost effective in that way. And yeah, just making for smooth and frictionless transactions that can always be tracked. I think the way platforms approach this is mostly through market making. Rather than kind of, and then also indeed more bottom up, if you will, and dispersed and distributed forms of market making. Mind you, of course, with the platform still being the market and data governor. So it's very not much distributed in that sense or decentralized, but it definitely has a different kind of approach to deal or to tackle the same objective that, again, both private and public organizations are very interested in: how to manage a city, how to see it, how to govern it, and again, frictionless and optimizations, I think, what ties both together.
Fantastic, thank you. And Justine, I saw you? Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think they're both really good explanations of what those differences are. In terms of what they have in common, I think what they have in common is that they are both based on a data extractive model, so they operate within the data economy. And it's about different ways that data is exploited and the kind of value that can come from that data and the management of that data. And I think that the smart cities model is partly because of its historical legacy and partly because of the kinds of public-private partnerships that are often involved in their implementation, their conceptualization, implementation, often have a larger scale in terms of thinking about city-wide management of services and how that data might say something about the city for the purposes of planning, whereas platforms can often be very specific and very narrow and operate, I was about to use the word disrupt, but I don't think I will, operate to reshape an existing service within a city without necessarily impacting on the larger urban planning paradigm, but at the same time negating the fact that there is always going to be an impact on the urban environment and the urban paradigm.
Fantastic. Rory,
That's a really great answer. I just wanted to add.
Look, I actually don't per se. I think we're trying to have a very wide view of what smart cities or smart places mean. And I think the reality is that we've seen lots of things that are not successful. Yeah. And we do need to learn lessons from that. What I would say, though, is that the hard bit is going to come when we think about how do we organize ourselves and create partnerships that are both across government, vertically and horizontally. So if you think about the 3 layers of government in Australia, but then also with the private sector and with citizens and with businesses as well. And that's where I think the two things kind of come together. I certainly don't view smart cities as, you know, smart lighting and smart bins and so forth, and people get excited about that. That's not what it's about. I mentioned about understanding the place, and that's where I think the sort of platform urbanism and the smart place that we're trying to drive to really start to come together.
Yeah, great, thank you. Audience.
Hi, thank you very much, everyone. I have many questions, but I will try to summarize in just a couple questions to Niels and one question in general to the panel. I was curious what happened with the drivers, with the workers of the delivery platforms in the post-pandemic thing, when the platform became more institutionalized. What happened to them? Did they just went away? Did they went into more? Is there evidence of alternative? Maybe they have created black markets or more informal settings using platforms. I have that question because it's like it's not that they went away. And I was curious about that element of the embeddedness of institutions, how platforms are becoming institutionalized and they are relating with the city, because I'm questioning where does that leave more decentralized forms or more open forms, or there's been a lot of discussion on platform cooperatives. Where is that? Or are platforms becoming, like any public service, a natural monopoly or a duopoly? Is that what's happening? And I think that's a question for the panel. What do you see? What is the space for more open, cooperative, these dialogues of platforms, even within smart places constructions in cities? What's the space for the non-corporate platform, the platforms that are more, quote unquote, democratic?
Right. Well, we might open up to Niels.
Thanks for those questions. I'll focus first on the first one, and I'll give an idea for the second question. So where do the workers go? I mean, they haven't left. They're still just to be sure, they're still working for these rapid delivery companies. They're still working for platforms, delivery platforms like Uber Eats, etc. So I'm not this. These are still operating in the city of Amsterdam. They're having a lot of trouble operating, but they still haven't left because they're constantly litigating. They're constantly thinking of new ways to stay open, as I also discussed. So it's not that these workers are now all of a sudden out of a job. If they do lose their jobs, they will most likely resort to other forms of low-wage service work, which many of the delivery workers also have experience with beforehand. But then, because due to the pandemic, they lost these jobs, and also now even when these jobs are returning, because there's a very tight labor market, they still stick with these jobs at the moment because they pay more than the average, waiting job or restaurant job or other types of jobs that mostly migrant men can get in the Netherlands. Also considering, the kinds of visas and permits they have. So I guess that would be my short answer to the first question. They're still there, but otherwise they most likely will return to the types of sectors that they already worked in. They will be less visible. And I guess the neighbors of the public nuisance complaint, those that filed the complaints, will be happy with that because we don't have to see them anymore. It doesn't mean that they're not there. Platform urbanism also renders particular things visible that we don't maybe like to see. The second question, I think that's when you have to really ask and talk to people that work in the municipality, that work for city governments. And of course, we have Rory here, so you will probably have a lot to say. For my part, I would say that, at least speaking for Amsterdam, I'm from Amsterdam here, that, we have a city whose city government has a CTO, a chief technology officer, and which has departments that are very much involved, very centered on private venture capital-backed initiatives, and being a startup incubator and being a startup city. And whenever we see the development of alternative initiatives, they just lack both the funding but also the institutional support oftentimes. So I would say that is where it has to start. You have to be creative about regulating which forms of regulation that don't only say no and that makes things impossible, like sending off those delivery companies to the edges of town, but also regulation and policy that actually is generative, that makes things possible for other initiatives, such as platform co-ops. And then you can also see, and then you can also have a look at what the city elsewhere, also in terms of capitalizing and resource and capacity building, can mean for these companies, because alone platform co-ops won't make it.
Thanks. Mike, Rory, respond.
Yeah, look, sort of really quickly, I think there's, so let me talk about this. There's obviously policy and thinking that goes with it. So if you, from the state government, we've got a lot of stuff on data policy, open data, and there's a big drive to try and make as much available. But then that creates questions over kind of, well, what is the value of that data in and of itself? And should it be assetized? And what role should government be taking in potentially monetizing it? We already produce a lot of open data, and third parties are creating value from that data. So just take, for instance, the Transport Open Data Platform, but also if you know a little bit of the history about that, you know that there's sort of definitely being sort of friction from third parties being able to sort of drive innovation, and kind of what does that mean? Even within government themselves, we're thinking cross-agency. Again, how do we make data available and share that? But I hope you appreciate that there's just an absolute ton of rules and regulation around information, as there should be, right? And as citizens would come to expect. So we do need to be very careful and respectful of that. And so when we do a data sharing agreement with two agencies, it's not necessarily just a straightforward thing. And so my message would be, we're sort of, these things need to be grappled with, but you will see it, there are good green shoots happening, and I'm happy to talk about that with you at drinks. I'll
just want to say one thing in response to your answer. I do think that there are some really good examples around of public-oriented platforms, but we need to think a little bit laterally about them. Public libraries, parks, cooperative housing, there are lots of examples. I think that what we're talking about here is a failure of imagination of what a smart platform could be.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And maybe, Sarah, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful sentiment to conclude with. I certainly, in the way that I frame platform urbanism, it's not only that it's a kind of a corporate vision of what a platform is. I think we all need to be advocating for the kind of public value opportunities around platform design that do share that value more equally with their users and across society. Yeah, I'll finish on that note.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And this lack of imagination is indeed on the side of maybe of policymakers and public administration, but also academics. I found myself very spoken to a moment ago, because I think me too I can also have better imagination about what constitutes a publicly oriented platform. That was a good point.
So actually, that is an excellent place to end on, I think. We're at time, but I think what we can take away is perhaps we all need to be a little bit more creative in our approaches and the questions that we ask of cities generally, and particularly platform urbanism and smart cities. So I would like to thank you all for joining this event today, and for your engagement during and prior to the event. And so I encourage all of you who are here to check out the rest of the events during the Festival of Urbanism this week, and also the Festival of Urbanism book series by the City Road podcast. So Dallas Rogers has been interviewing some of the authors of these fantastic books. So all of those details are on the website. And I'd especially like to thank all of our presenters today, and Neil's from Zooming In. I think we had such an incredible range of speakers here and covering so much of different aspects. And also, Rory, it was so good to have somebody actually from government talking to us, because as Neil said, as academics, we often come in with an angle that doesn't always, I think, correlate to what happens in government, and not always, I think, as attuned and aware of the thought that goes into this at a government level. So thank you, everyone. I'd like to invite you out to the drinks outside, our conversations and over refreshments in the foyer. And again, Niels, it would be great if you could join us in person, maybe sometime in the future. So thank you.
Hopefully, thank you.